Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be looking at an endgame sort of study type position. I believe the study of which can actually help you become a much better endgame player in general, and the study of which can actually help you with your chess play in general, basically in all phases of the game. It can really teach you how to calculate and how to prioritize what types of positions are important and what you should be looking at when you calculate. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. Now, if you first took a look at this endgame position, you would actually be deceived into thinking this position was extremely simple. Black has managed to advance his pawns extremely far. Black is actually threatening mate in 1 right now, and it looks like white is just kind of in dire straits. But this position is actually white to move and draw. So if you think that you can find that move, go ahead and pause the video and see if you can find it. So the move, and the only move that draws in this position, is actually the move Rook A2. So a big part of this is that white's moves are actually kind of limited, because there was this F2 mate threat that was on the table, and white needed to be able to meet that. So white's main thing here is white needs to constantly counter threat in this position. The main thing about this position is that black is essentially playing for 2 results. Black is either going to draw or he's going to win, whereas white is basically playing for 1 result. Even a king and a rook versus a king and a knight should still be a draw. So white should basically be content to just exchange his rook for black's 2 remaining pawns and get a draw, or otherwise try to force some sort of stalemate position, in which case he can get a draw. And that's the main thing that you have to continually calculate in these positions for both sides. For black, if he wants to play for a win, and for white, if he wants to play for a draw, is you have to constantly be calculating these stalemate combinations. So basically, white's threat here is white is actually threatening to play rook takes g2. And he intends to play rook g2, fg2 with stalemate against just about any black move other than f2. And on f2, he intends to sacrifice for that f2 pawn. So if black were to play pawn to f2 check, he would play rook f2, and then this position would be a draw pretty much regardless, but let's just say knight f2, and we have a draw. We could also play something like knight e3, and we can draw really easily by taking that second pawn, and you can't checkmate me with just a king and a knight. We could also draw really easily by just going after the knight. We could play rook e2, and then if the knight moves, we take the pawn for free and we start playing for a win. If the king moves to defend the knight, we simply sacrifice for that knight, and king versus king is clearly a draw. So we've got a couple of options on how to get a draw there. Now, what's interesting is this position is a draw at this point regardless. Any king move, and we're going to play rook takes g2 with either a stalemate or grabbing the 2 pawns for the piece. If the king moves backwards, we're going to grab those 2 pawns for the piece. Any knight move, and pretty much the same thing, other than the move, which is a little bit complicated here. They could try something like knight e3. So let's say knight e3 or possibly knight g5. So let's say that they play knight e3. You can actually see right here that at this point, after knight e3, it's not so simple. Like if I play rook takes g2, I don't get an easy draw. If they play f takes g2, that's a draw, but they could just play knight takes g2, and now black is winning. So like I said, these positions are deceptively complicated, right? So another thing that I can't do is I can't play a move like rook to I can't play a move like rook to a3, because if I play a move like rook to a3, f2 is mate. So at this point, stop and pause the video and see if you can find a move that would still lead to a draw for white. It's actually kind of complicated. Okay, so if you think that you found it, that move is rook f2. But actually, it could have been just about any rook move along this second rank to simply maintain that position. The only thing that white needs to do is just always be prepared to play rook takes g2 when it works. So basically, if the king retreats and just kind of maintains this position, we can just keep shuffling our rook back and forth, rook a2 to f2, and we can just keep our rook a2, f2. We can even play rook b2, rook d2. Pretty much any rook move along this rank is going to maintain the equality. As soon as that knight moves, we're going to play rook takes g2, and we're going to get an easy draw. Okay, so even if we have some sort of maneuver, like if the king goes to here, like if king h3, now we can play rook f2, and this is the really critical thing, is whenever this king goes to h3, as long as we play rook f2, it really limits black's replies. And this is important. We always have to have stalemate on the table. In case this knight moves away, we need to be able to play rook g2, fg2 with stalemate. And that's not always going to be possible if the king has this retreat square available to it. So like if, for example, we play some random move like rook b2, and then they retreat the knight, and now we decide to sacrifice, they can take back with the pawn, and we do have a retreat square for our king, so we don't have stalemate, just as a kind of a thought experiment type of thing. So what we want to do is we want to put this immediate pressure, we want to play rook f2, so that we're just threatening to play rook takes f3 in all cases. And if we play rook f2, and we are threatening to play rook f3 in all cases, it limits their responses. So now if they play king g3, they're back to creating this stalemate possibility, and we can simply shuffle our rook back and forth, rook b2, rook a2. So they could also try a knight move here, but any knight move that gets played here is not going to be defending this pawn on the f3 square. And white will simply be able to take that pawn with check, and will simply be able to take on g2. So that would be the drawing method. But let's take a look at a move that doesn't draw. Let's take a look at how easy it is to actually lose these positions. But also, I want you to appreciate just how complicated these positions really are. Because there are a number of circumstances where black can actually win in these positions, where it looks like white is still holding the balance, but he's not. And that's actually something that's really impressive. So the losing move here, which also prevents f2 check, would be the move rook to a3, which would lose. Now, there is an easy and quick way for black to win the game from here, so if you think you see it, go ahead and pause the video and see if you can find that next move for black to move and win. So if you found it, congratulations. The easy move to win is knight f2, simply threatening knight h3 mate. Now, since that mate threat is so direct, it doesn't leave white with a lot of options. He has to sacrifice for this pawn, and unfortunately the white king has an escape square, and once he has that escape square, we're able to finish the game by pushing our pawn, making a queen, and then simply getting mate. Mate would actually follow very quickly here. Now, I know you're thinking, well, it's fortunate that I had my knight on g4 in this case to go to f2 and come back to h3. What happens if I make another move? Is black still winning? If I play something like knight e5, is black still winning? If I can reorganize and get away from these stalemate threats, is black still winning? Knight e5 still wins. But white can put up some very stiff resistance and can actually almost get to a draw. So white's next move here, which is a very annoying move, and it's the only move that white can really try to keep playing for a draw here, is kind of the amazing looking rook to d3. Now this rook d3 technically still loses, but at this point there is only one black move that continues to play for a win here. All other black moves will lead to a draw in this position. Now, of course, the obvious is knight takes rook, but if we play knight takes rook, that is immediate stalemate. So again, calculating those stalemate combinations with impunity, very, very important, right? So there's other moves, like we could play like any king move, for example. So we could play king h3, for instance. Okay, so on king h3, now we're going to play rook back to d2, and we have this very similar issue from before, is we're basically just trying to play rook g2, where it's going to be a draw. We're also trying to play king to f2 in some situations where we can shuffle this rook back to d1, and we can obtain a draw that way, depending on exactly what black tries. Now in this case, on any king move, king g3, king h4, king g4, we're going to play rook g2, and that's a draw. So if king g4, rook g2 sacrifices the rook for 2 pawns, on king h4, rook g2 sacrifices the rook for 2 pawns and gets a draw, and on king g3, rook g2, fg2 is simply a stalemate, and that's a draw. So that means that black would have to try something like knight g6 to try to play for a win, and then again, this is the critical idea. We have to play rook f2 and pressure that pawn on f3. And without this pressuring continuation, we don't get the draw here. If we don't play rook f2, we're not getting that draw. We have to force that king back to the g3 square in order for our rook takes g2, f takes g2 stalemate idea to work. We have to have no escape squares for the white king in order for this to work, and we have to do this with tempo. So again, we've countered every single king move in this position, so now the only moves that make sense are going to be knight moves. So they could play a move like knight h4, in which case we obviously can't play rook f3, knight f3 is mate, and on rook g2, they're going to have knight takes g2, and they have an escape square. So what do? We shuffle that rook back and forth on the second rank, and we simply defend, and we wait for him to either play king g3 or to move his knight away. And if he moves his knight away, he can never quite move his knight to a place that doesn't allow us some sort of drawing continuation. So if knight f5, for example, now we can play king f2, threatening that f3 pawn again. He has a limited number of moves that he can play to defend that f3 pawn. So he could try something like, say, knight h6, trying to bring that knight to g4, and then we could play rook down, defending that queen square, knight g4, king takes, and then after knight h2, king f2, knight g4, king f3, knight h2, we have a draw by perpetual, and we're keeping that g-pawn under wraps. The other way, of course, they could try to play this is after king to f2, they could, of course, try something like king to g4, but on king to g4, we have a number of moves, all of which lead to a draw. We can again just simply play our rook back to d1, and then let's just come up with, I don't know, a random knight move. They all apparently fail. So like knight to g3, and now we could just play something like rook d4 check, and then king g5, and then we can actually just play rook d8, and this should be a draw because we're just going to check this king from behind, and there's no shelter, and we're always going to be able to keep the queening square under wraps. So if, for example, knight e2, we'll be able to obtain a draw again by sacrificing this rook for these two pawns. So we're going to play something like rook check, king f4, rook g2, f g2, king g2 is draw. So again, anytime we can sacrifice the rook for the two pawns, it's going to be a draw. So going back, I mentioned that after rook to d3, this position is actually not a draw. This position is winning for black. So you might be wondering, after all the continuations I just showed you where white was able to obtain this draw by sacrificing the rook for these two pawns, or by creating a stalemate in some other way, how could black possibly win? Black has to play a very specific move here. So this move is black to move and win, and there is really only one move that wins, so it's kind of an amazing position. So stop and pause the video and see if you can find it. And that move is knight g6, and that move would get 2 exclamation marks if you found it. It is the only move that wins. So here, black is still threatening f2 mate, and you don't have rook f3, king f3, because there's that escape square on h2. So you're going to have to just kind of shuffle your rook somewhere where you still have a draw. So you could try something like rook d2, so you're going to meet f2 with rook takes f2, and now here's the critical idea. Here's the critical move. Knight f4. And this works because we're defending that g2 pawn. So this is really kind of the formation of the king, knight, and pawns that you have to remember if you want to try to win this. If you can get that knight to f4 and you can hold that g2 pawn with your knight, you can recapture that pawn with your knight. And when you recapture that g2 pawn with your knight, it is not going to be stalemate. So rook g2 as a stalemating idea, it does not work. But more importantly, you are threatening knight to h3 mate. And that move is impossible to stop. So white would actually have to play rook g2 in this position if he just wants to keep playing chess. So rook g2 is forced. Any other move, we're going to play knight h3, and that's checkmate. There is no other move here. So rook g2 would be forced, knight g2, king f1, and then we can just make a queen. Just knight e3 check, king e1, f2, king d2, f1 equals queen, and then black actually mates relatively quickly here, and black would win the game. Okay, so, you know, this endgame, the beginning of this endgame, you were probably just looking at it going, this should be easy. You know, we have two pawns, we're threatening to mate, black is playing for 2 results, right? But again, these endgames are really complicated, and just remembering a couple of critical formations is so key. Just the critical formations that you kind of want to remember are the positions where you have a win, so like something like knight f2, or something like where you get this knight to f4 is going to be a win. But if your knight is kind of located on any other square, and they can shuffle their rook on the a2 square, so if, for example, just rook a2, as long as they can shuffle their rook back and forth from here on this second rank and constantly threaten to sacrifice the rook for the stalemate or the rook for 2 pawns, if the knight hasn't accessed the f2 or the f4 square yet, these positions are going to be drawn. And that's the critical information that you need to know whether your position is going to be a draw or whether your position is going to be a win, and that'll help guide your calculations so that you can make the appropriate decisions when you're playing, and not just this endgames, but endgames like this, which actually come up a lot. Okay, so I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.